When a struggling farmer discovers a mysterious creature hiding in his cornfield, he can't believe his eyes. As he approaches it cautiously, the animal's unusual features leave him speechless. But when scientists finally reveal its true origin, the shocking discovery changes his life forever and rewrites everything we thought we knew about wildlife in North America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. There, among the towering stalks of corn, a pair of iridescent eyes reflected back at Frank Whitaker's flashlight beam, eyes unlike anything he'd ever seen on his Montana farm. The creature's outline was barely visible in the dim morning light, but its peculiar silhouette and unnatural movements made his heart race. What he'd initially dismissed as damage from local deer had led him to something that would soon capture the attention of scientists worldwide. Standing frozen in place, Frank watched as the animal moved slightly, revealing a shimmer of scales that seemed to change color with each movement. It wasn't a coyote, mountain lion, or any other wildlife native to the area. In fact, it didn't look like anything he'd ever seen in his 40 years of farming, not even in nature documentaries. For several minutes, he remained still, his mind racing with possibilities, completely unaware that this chance encounter would not only save his struggling farm, but also spark one of the most significant zoological discoveries of the century. The morning had started like any other on Whitaker Farm. Frank had risen before dawn, troubled by the mysterious damage he'd been finding in his cornfields over the past week. Entire sections of his crop had been flattened in peculiar patterns, nothing like the usual deer or elk damage he was accustomed to dealing with. With the farm already struggling under mounting debts and a 3-year drought, he couldn't afford to lose any more of his harvest. Armed with just his flashlight and determination, Frank had set out to catch whatever was destroying his crops. He'd expected to find tracks, broken stalks, or maybe even catch a glimpse of the usual crop-raiding suspects. Instead, he found himself face to face with something that defied explanation. The creature was roughly the size of a large dog, but that's where any resemblance to familiar animals ended. Its body seemed to ripple with an otherworldly iridescence, shifting between deep purple and electric blue in the beam of his flashlight. What he had first thought were scales now appeared to be something else entirely, a sort of armored plating that moved fluidly with each breath the creature took. Frank's hand instinctively moved toward his phone in his pocket, but he stopped himself. Years of experience with wildlife had taught him that sudden movements could spook animals into either flight or aggression. Neither scenario would help him understand what he was dealing with. Besides, who would believe him without proper evidence? He needed to handle this situation carefully. The creature's eyes remained fixed on him, displaying an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. Unlike the reflective eyes of deer or coyotes, these seemed to glow with their own inner light, pulsing softly in the pre-dawn darkness. Most striking was their color, a deep amber with swirling patterns that seemed to move and change as he watched. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the morning mist, Frank noticed something even more bizarre. The creature appeared to be creating some sort of structure among the cornstalks. The flattened patterns he'd been finding weren't random damage at all. They were methodical, almost geometric in their precision. Surrounding the creature were carefully bent stalks, forming what looked like an intricate nest or shelter. Frank's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be some kind of undiscovered species, an escaped exotic pet, or something else entirely? In all his years of watching nature documentaries and reading farming magazines, he'd never seen or heard of anything like this. The discovery both terrified and excited him. If this was truly something unknown to science, it could be the answer to his prayers or the beginning of a nightmare. Just then the creature made a sound that stopped Frank's breathing entirely. It wasn't a growl, bark, or any other animal sound he'd ever heard. Instead, it was a series of melodic tones, almost like music that seemed to resonate through his chest. The sound was both beautiful and unsettling, and it made one thing absolutely clear. Whatever this creature was, it was far more extraordinary than anything Frank could have imagined. But as he stood there, transfixed by the otherworldly encounter, Frank had no way of knowing that this moment would spark a chain of events that would not only transform his struggling farm, but also challenge everything scientists thought they knew about life on Earth. His simple morning patrol had led him to a discovery that would soon draw the attention of experts from around the globe and turn his quiet corner of Montana into the center of a worldwide scientific sensation. The question was, what should he do next? The creature was clearly intelligent and potentially vulnerable. If he made the wrong move, he might lose this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But if he handled this right, this incredible discovery might just be the miracle he'd been praying for. Frank Whitaker's connection to Golden Valley Farm ran as deep as the roots of the century-old oak tree that stood proudly at its entrance. For 5 generations, his family had worked this land, transforming the rugged Montana soil into one of the most respected corn and wheat operations in Phillips County. But lately, the proud legacy that had been passed down to him was slipping through his fingers like the dry soil he'd been battling for the past 3 years. At 53, Frank's weathered face told the story of countless dawn-to-dusk workdays under the brutal Montana sun. His calloused hands and stooped shoulders bore witness to years of physical labor, while the deepening worry lines around his eyes reflected the mounting pressure of keeping the farm afloat. The man who had once been known for his hearty laugh and optimistic outlook now spent most evenings poring over financial statements trying to figure out how to make ends meet. Just 5 years ago, Golden Valley Farm had been thriving. Frank's innovative farming techniques and dedication to sustainable practices had earned him Farmer of the Year recognition from the Montana Agricultural Association. His corn yields were the envy of neighboring farms, and his wheat quality consistently commanded premium prices. Local agricultural students would visit to learn about his successful operation, and Frank took pride in sharing the knowledge passed down through generations of Whitakers. But then, everything changed. The drought hit first, 3 consecutive years of rainfall so scarce it seemed as if the sky had forgotten how to cry. Frank had watched helplessly as his once lush cornfields withered under the relentless sun, the plants struggling to survive in soil that grew more parched with each passing season. His irrigation system, adequate for normal years, couldn't keep up with the extreme conditions. The cost of additional water rights was astronomical, and the wells were drawing from ever deeper depths. The financial impact was devastating. Crop yields plummeted to less than half of their previous levels, while operating costs soared. Frank had been forced to lay off 3 of his 5 full-time workers, trusted employees who had been with him for over a decade. The decision had torn at his heart, but with bank payments looming and equipment repairs eating into his reserves, he'd had no choice. Sarah, his wife of 30 years, had taken a job as a teacher's assistant at the local elementary school to help make ends meet. It was the first time since their marriage that she'd had to work off the farm, and though she never complained, Frank could see the strain in her eyes when she returned home each evening, only to face more work helping him with the farm's books. Their children had noticed the change too. Emma, their eldest, had offered to postpone her final year of veterinary school to come home and help, but Frank had refused. He couldn't bear the thought of his children sacrificing their dreams because of his failures. Their younger son, Michael, already working as an engineer in Seattle, had offered to send money home, but Frank's pride wouldn't allow it. The Whitakers had always been givers, not takers. The community had watched the farm's decline with growing concern. Golden Valley Farm had always been a cornerstone of local agriculture, providing seasonal employment and setting standards for farming practices in the region. Frank's grandfather had helped establish the county's first agricultural cooperative, and his father had served on the regional water management board for 2 decades. The Whitaker name meant something in these parts, and Frank felt the weight of that legacy every time he drove into town. Last month, Milton Hayes, the regional bank manager who handled Frank's loans, had called him in for a meeting. The conversation still echoed in Frank's mind. "Frank, you've got until the end of harvest season to get current on your payments. I've pushed this as far as I can with the board, but if something doesn't change..." The unfinished sentence had hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Frank had tried everything he could think of. He'd applied for government assistance programs, consulted with agricultural extension agents, and even considered converting part of his operation to organic certification in hopes of commanding higher prices. But each potential solution required time or capital he didn't have, and the bank's deadline loomed ever closer. The strange damage to his corn crop over the past week couldn't have come at a worse time. He'd estimated the destroyed areas had already cost him several $1,000s in potential yield, and he couldn't afford to lose any more. That's what had driven him out into the fields before dawn this morning. Desperation to protect what little he had left. But now, standing in his damaged cornfield and staring at a creature that seemed to defy the laws of nature, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Though he didn't yet understand what he was looking at or what it might mean, his farmer's intuition told him this discovery could change everything. The question was, would this mysterious creature prove to be his salvation, or just another challenge in an already overwhelming situation? As Frank stood rooted to the spot, his mind raced through every possible course of action. The creature continued to observe him with those mesmerizing amber eyes, maintaining a strange sort of standoff that felt more like a first meeting between intelligent beings than an encounter with wildlife. The musical tones it had produced earlier still echoed in his memory, unlike anything he'd ever heard in nature. His first instinct was to call the local wildlife authorities. That would be the responsible thing to do, wouldn't it? But something held him back. Years of dealing with government agencies had taught him that bureaucracy moved slowly, and control would be taken out of his hands immediately. The creature would likely be captured, quarantined, and he'd never know what became of it. Plus, if word got out about something this unusual, his struggling farm would be overrun with curiosity seekers and media before he could blink. Then there was the scientific community to consider. Frank had watched enough nature documentaries to know that the discovery of a new species was a big deal, let alone one that seemed this unusual. His mind wandered to the famous cryptozoology stories he'd seen on television, grainy photos of supposed creatures that always turned out to be hoaxes or misidentified known animals. But this was different. This was real, and it was right in front of him. The financial implications weren't lost on him either. If this truly was an undiscovered species, it could be his ticket out of debt. Documentary rights, research access fees, maybe even tourism if handled properly. The possibilities were endless. But as soon as this thought crossed his mind, Frank felt a pang of guilt. The creature was looking at him with such intelligence. Could he really treat it like a carnival attraction? His phone felt heavy in his pocket. One call could set events in motion that couldn't be undone. The creature had chosen his land, his cornfield, for whatever it was doing with those geometric patterns. Maybe that meant something. Maybe he had a responsibility to understand more before involving others who might not have the creature's best interests at heart. "What are you?" Frank whispered, more to himself than the creature. To his astonishment, it tilted its head slightly at the sound of his voice, the iridescent patterns on its body shifting in a way that seemed almost responsive. The movement was so human-like that it sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There was clear intelligence behind those eyes. Frank took a slow step forward, and the creature remained still. Another step, and still no sign of fear or aggression. The distance between them had shrunk to about 20 feet when he noticed something else. There were markings in the soil around the flattened corn stalks. Not random tracks, but deliberate patterns that seemed to mirror the geometric shapes formed by the bent plants above. His farming experience told him that these patterns couldn't have been made by any known wildlife. The precision was too perfect, the designs too complex. Whatever this creature was, it was creating something with purpose. Destroying his crops wasn't an act of feeding or vandalism. It was construction of some kind. Sarah's voice echoed in his head, reminding him of all the times she'd told him he was too trusting, too willing to see the good in situations that could harm him. But she wasn't here to see those intelligent eyes, to hear that otherworldly song, to witness the deliberate care with which the creature moved. This didn't feel dangerous, it felt important. Frank reached a decision. He would document everything carefully but keep the discovery to himself, at least for now. He needed time to understand what he was dealing with before the outside world rushed in to take over. He had a digital camera in his truck, and years of keeping detailed farm records had taught him the importance of thorough documentation. The morning light was growing stronger, and soon his regular farm hands would be arriving for work. He needed to act quickly if he wanted to keep this secret. Looking directly at the creature, Frank spoke softly but clearly. "I don't know if you can understand me, but I'm going to help you. Just stay here, please." To his amazement, the creature lowered its head in what almost looked like a nod. The gesture was so clear, so deliberate, that Frank nearly stumbled backward in shock. This wasn't just about protecting an unusual animal anymore. He was becoming involved in something far more extraordinary. As he backed away slowly toward his truck, plans were already forming in his mind. He would need to redirect his workers away from this section of the field. The creature's nest or shelter or whatever it was building would need to be protected. He'd have to find a way to monitor it without drawing attention. Most importantly, he'd need to figure out exactly what he was dealing with before deciding how to proceed. Walking back to his truck, Frank felt the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. He was choosing to harbor what might be the most significant scientific discovery of the century on his failing farm, keeping it secret from everyone, including his own family. The risk was enormous, but something deep in his gut told him it was the right choice. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, driven by something more than just the desperate need to keep his farm afloat. Little did Frank know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only transform his life, but challenge humanity's understanding of life itself. By mid-morning, Frank had developed a careful strategy to protect his extraordinary discovery. After retrieving his old digital camera from the truck, he'd spent an hour photographing everything: the creature, which had remained surprisingly cooperative, the intricate patterns in his cornfield, and the mysterious markings in the soil. His hands had trembled as he reviewed the images, hardly daring to believe they would actually show what he'd seen. But there it was, clear as day, proof that he wasn't losing his mind. The first challenge came when his farm hands arrived for their daily assignments. Mike Peterson and young Tommy Clark had worked these fields long enough to know their usual routine, and any sudden changes would raise questions. Frank gathered them near the equipment shed, purposefully keeping them away from the southeastern corner of the property where the creature had made its home. "We're trying something new with crop rotation," Frank explained, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "I want to leave the southeast section alone for now, running a bit of an experiment with soil recovery." The lie felt bitter on his tongue, but he pushed through. "We'll focus on the western fields this week. They need more attention anyway." Tommy, eager and fresh out of agricultural college, immediately launched into a discussion about soil chemistry and recovery methods. Frank nodded along, grateful for the young man's enthusiasm even as his mind wandered back to those iridescent scales and intelligent eyes. Mike, who'd worked the farm for 15 years, gave Frank a curious look but said nothing. Frank made a mental note to keep a closer eye on Mike. The man knew the farm's rhythms too well to be easily fooled. After sending his workers off to their tasks, Frank returned to his house to gather supplies. He needed to set up some way to monitor the creature without drawing attention. In the garage, he found his old hunting cameras, battery-powered, motion-activated units he'd once used to track deer movements. They weren't the highest quality, but they would serve his purpose. Sarah was thankfully already at her teaching job, so Frank didn't have to explain why he was gathering equipment. He felt a pang of guilt at keeping such a massive secret from his wife of 30 years, but he reasoned that he needed to understand the situation better before involving anyone else, even her. Back in the field, Frank worked methodically. He positioned the trail cameras at different angles, carefully concealing them among the corn stalks. The creature watched his work with what seemed like curiosity, occasionally emitting those haunting musical tones that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Each time it vocalized, Frank found himself pausing, trying to discern any pattern or meaning in the sounds. The geometric patterns in the cornfield had expanded slightly since his first discovery. Frank took careful measurements and sketched them in his farm notebook, usually reserved for crop yields and equipment maintenance schedules. The designs reminded him of crop circles he'd seen in documentaries, but these were different. more organic, flowing patterns that seemed to pulse with purpose. As he worked, Frank began to notice more details about the creature. Its movements were extraordinarily graceful, almost liquid in their fluidity. The armored plating he'd first observed seemed to shift and change, not just in color, but in texture, sometimes appearing metallic, other times more like living tissue. Most fascinating were its interactions with the corn plants. It didn't break or damage them so much as gently reshape them, using some unknown method to bend the stalks without breaking them. Around noon, Frank made his first attempt at providing food. He'd brought a variety of options, some corn, naturally, fresh vegetables from Sarah's garden, and even some leftover chicken from last night's dinner. The creature showed no interest in any of it. Instead, Frank observed it seemingly drawing sustenance directly from the soil itself, its scaled appendages extending into the earth in a way that defied explanation. He spent the afternoon creating a detailed journal entry, something he could refer back to as events unfolded. Day 1, he wrote, then paused, considering the magnitude of what he was documenting. He described the creature's physical appearance in as much detail as possible, noted its behaviors, and sketched the evolving patterns in his field. The scientific part of his mind knew these records could be crucial later, while the farmer in him worried about the mounting costs of the damaged crops. As the sun began to set, Frank made one final trip to check on his unusual guest. The creature had expanded its geometric pattern by several feet, but still showed no signs of aggression or fear toward him. If anything, it seemed to have grown more comfortable with his presence, the musical tones of its communication becoming more frequent and complex. Before heading home, Frank rigged up some simple barriers using spare equipment and caution tape, creating a wide perimeter around the area under the guise of equipment storage. It wasn't much, but it would help keep his workers away from this section of the field. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now part of something much bigger than himself, something that transcended his immediate concerns about the farm's survival. That evening, as Frank sat at his kitchen table pushing food around his plate, Sarah commented on how distracted he seemed. "Just worried about the harvest," he replied, hating the deception but knowing it was necessary for now. Later, lying awake in bed, he watched the digital clock tick past midnight and wondered what tomorrow would bring. The trail cameras were out there recording. The creature was hopefully still in his field, and he was now officially keeper of what might be the biggest secret in scientific history. The next 7 days became an intricate dance of secrecy and observation. Each morning, Frank would rise before dawn, his heart racing as he made his way to the southeastern field, half afraid he'd find the creature gone, or worse, discovered by someone else. But each morning it was there, continuing its mysterious work with unwavering dedication. The geometric patterns had grown more complex, now covering nearly an acre of his cornfield. From ground level, it was impossible to grasp the full scope of the design, but Frank's trail cameras had captured enough footage for him to piece together a rough idea of its scale. The creature worked with methodical precision, each new addition to the pattern flowing seamlessly into the existing structure. What troubled Frank most was the increasing difficulty of keeping his secret. Mike Peterson, his experienced farmhand, had started asking pointed questions about the soil recovery experiment. Yesterday, he'd caught Mike standing at the edge of the restricted area, staring intently at the bent corn stalks with a furrowed brow. "Strangest recovery method I've ever seen," Mike had commented, forcing Frank to quickly change the subject. The financial pressure was mounting too. Frank had received another call from Milton Hayes at the bank. "Your payment deadline is approaching, Frank," Milton had reminded him, his voice carrying that mixture of professional concern and personal sympathy that made it even harder to bear. "Do you have a plan?" Frank had mumbled something about potential investors, all too aware of the irony. He was sitting on perhaps the most valuable discovery in modern history, but he couldn't tell a soul. Sarah had noticed the change in him as well. After 30 years of marriage, she could read him like one of her elementary school books. "You're up to something," she'd said over coffee this morning, her eyes searching his face. "I haven't seen you this wound up since the drought first hit." Frank had managed a weak smile and blamed it on stress, but he knew she wasn't buying it. The creature itself had begun exhibiting new behaviors that both fascinated and concerned Frank. Its color-changing abilities had become more pronounced, and it could now perfectly mimic the golden hue of the cornfields, making it nearly invisible to the casual observer. The musical tones of its communication had grown more complex, often carrying for longer distances than before. Frank had started recording them on his phone, hoping to detect some pattern or meaning in the haunting sounds. But most worrying were the lights. They had started 3 nights ago, subtle at first, just a faint luminescence around the creature's geometric patterns. But each night they grew stronger, pulsing with an otherworldly glow that Frank feared would soon be visible from the nearby road. He'd taken to parking his truck strategically to block the view from passing cars, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. The physical toll of maintaining constant vigilance was beginning to show. Frank's sleep was interrupted by every distant sound. His meals were rushed affairs between monitoring sessions, and the regular work of running the farm was starting to suffer. He'd caught himself making silly mistakes, missing equipment maintenance schedules, forgetting to order supplies, showing up late for meetings with suppliers. Last night, things had taken an even more concerning turn. While reviewing the trail camera footage, Frank had spotted something that made his blood run cold. In several frames captured around midnight, there were distinct flashes of light in the sky above the geometric patterns. They weren't like any aircraft he'd ever seen. The movements were too erratic, the lights too intense. Was the creature trying to communicate with something up there? The implications were staggering. Frank had been operating under the assumption that he was dealing with an undiscovered terrestrial species, but these new developments pointed to something far more extraordinary. The geometric patterns, the lights, the strange communications, it all suggested a level of sophistication that went beyond anything in his experience. This morning he'd noticed something else troubling. The soil around the geometric patterns had begun to change. What had started as simple markings had evolved into something more profound. The earth itself seemed to be transforming, taking on an unusual crystalline quality that sparkled in the morning light. Frank had taken samples, storing them in old mason jars in his truck, but he had no way to analyze them without raising questions. As he stood at the edge of the transformed area, watching the creature continue its mysterious work, Frank felt the weight of his isolation more heavily than ever. He was in over his head, dealing with something that clearly had implications far beyond his farm or his financial troubles. But who could he trust? The wrong choice could lead to disaster. For him, for his farm, and for this extraordinary creature that had chosen his land for its inscrutable purpose. The sound of an approaching vehicle snapped Frank from his thoughts. Through the corn he could see dust rising from his access road. Someone was coming. Panic seized him as he realized he'd forgotten about his scheduled meeting with the seed supplier. Rushing back to his truck, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He needed to make a decision soon before circumstances forced his hand. As he drove away, watching the mysterious lights pulse faintly even in the morning sun, Frank knew he was reaching a critical point. The creature's activities were becoming too obvious to hide, his own behavior too suspicious to explain away. Something had to give, and soon. The crisis struck with devastating suddenness on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Frank had just finished his regular check on the creature when he noticed Mike Peterson's truck parked at the far edge of the restricted area. His heart nearly stopped when he saw not just Mike, but also 2 strangers standing beside the vehicle, their professional attire distinctly out of place among the cornfields. As Frank approached, he could hear Mike's voice carried on the wind. Been acting strange for weeks now. Restricted access, odd lights at night, and these patterns. The strangers were nodding, one of them taking photographs with a professional-looking camera, while the other scribbled notes on a tablet. "Mike!" Frank called out, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "I wasn't expecting visitors today." The group turned, and Frank's stomach dropped as he noticed the logo on one man's jacket, National Geographic. Mike had the decency to look uncomfortable, but there was also determination in his farmhand's weathered face. "Sorry, Frank," Mike said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. But something ain't right here. These patterns, the lights at night, the way you've been acting, I've worked this land with you for 15 years. I know when something's off." He gestured to the strangers. "These fellows are from National Geographic. They're doing a piece on unusual agricultural phenomena." The taller of the two men stepped forward, extending his hand. "Dr. James Morrison, Mr. Whitaker. Your employee contacted us about some unusual occurrences on your property. We're particularly interested in these geometric patterns we've been hearing about." Before Frank could respond, a familiar musical tone echoed across the field. The sound was louder than ever before, and Frank watched in horror as both researchers' eyes widened. The shorter man whispered something to his colleague, already reaching for his phone. "I need everyone to leave," Frank said firmly, stepping between the men and the direction of the sound. "This is private property, and I haven't authorized any photography or research here." "Mr. Whitaker," Dr. Morrison said carefully, "what we're seeing here could be significantly important. The patterns in your field, these unusual sounds, they bear striking similarities to reports we've been investigating in other parts of the world. If there's something here—" A sudden flash of light from deep within the cornfield interrupted him. The creature's luminescence had become visible even in broad daylight, its patterns pulsing with an intensity Frank had never seen before. The researchers' equipment began beeping and chirping, and both men became visibly excited. "Extraordinary energy readings," the shorter man muttered, staring at his devices. "Similar to the Kazakhstan incident last year." Frank's mind raced. He had to protect the creature, but the situation was rapidly spinning out of control. As if responding to his distress, another series of musical tones filled the air, followed by more flashing lights. The cornstalks began swaying despite the lack of wind. "We should call the authorities," Mike said, his voice shaking slightly. "FBI, military, somebody who can handle whatever this is." "No!" Frank shouted, more forcefully than he'd intended. "This is my land, my responsibility. I won't have government agents trampling through my fields." But even as he spoke, he could see more vehicles approaching along the access road. Word was spreading. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Sarah. "Frank, why are there news vans at the end of our driveway?" The creature's lights pulsed again, more urgently now. The researchers' equipment was going haywire, emitting a cacophony of beeps and alerts. Frank could feel the situation slipping through his fingers like grain through a sieve. "Mr. Whitaker," Dr. Morrison said, his professional demeanor cracking slightly, "I don't think you understand the magnitude of what might be happening here. If this is what we suspect—" A deafening tone cut through the air, causing everyone to cover their ears. The light show intensified, and Frank watched in horror as the geometric patterns began to glow with an inner fire. The crystalline transformation he'd observed in the soil was spreading rapidly, creating a web of luminescent veins through his field. More vehicles were arriving. Police cars now, their lights flashing. Frank could hear excited voices, the slam of car doors, the whir of news cameras. His phone was buzzing constantly, Sarah, the bank, unknown numbers. The secret was out, and there was nothing he could do to contain it. In that moment of crisis, Frank realized his mistake. He'd tried so hard to protect the creature, to keep its existence secret, that he'd failed to prepare for the inevitable discovery. Now everything was happening at once, chaotically, beyond his control. His farm would soon be overrun, the creature exposed, and any hope of managing the situation lost in the media frenzy that was about to explode. As he stood there, watching his carefully constructed secrecy crumble, Frank heard one final musical tone, different from the others, almost sad in its resonance. He turned toward the sound, and for a brief moment, locked eyes with the creature through the cornstalks. In that gaze, he saw something that made his heart sink. Fear. The being he'd tried to protect was now more vulnerable than ever, and it was all his fault. The sound of helicopters approached in the distance, and Frank knew the true crisis was only beginning. Whatever happened next would change not just his life, but potentially the entire world's understanding of life itself. and he had no idea how to handle what was coming. Just as the situation seemed completely hopeless, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the gathering crowd. A tall, distinguished-looking woman in her early 60s emerged, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Without hesitation, she strode through the chaos, flashing some kind of identification that made even the eager reporters step aside. Two younger men in suits followed in her wake, efficiently establishing a perimeter. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, Institute for Advanced Biological Studies, she announced, approaching Frank with purposeful steps. Her voice carried an authority that somehow cut through the pandemonium. Mr. Whitaker, I believe you and I need to have an urgent conversation about your visitor. Frank stared at her, confusion mixing with desperate hope. How did you know? She smiled slightly. We've been monitoring unusual energy signatures across the country. Your friend here, she gestured toward the cornfield, has a rather distinctive signal. May we speak privately? Before Frank could respond, Sarah's voice cut through the crowd. Frank, she pushed her way through, still wearing her teaching assistant's badge. What in the world is going on? Why is our farm crawling with reporters? Her eyes were wide with confusion and hurt. Dr. Matthews smoothly intercepted her. Mrs. Whitaker, perfect timing. You should be part of this conversation too. Shall we step inside? The next hour in Frank's kitchen was unlike anything he could have imagined. Dr. Matthews explained that her institute was a private organization dedicated to investigating and protecting unusual biological phenomena. They'd been tracking similar incidents worldwide, working quietly to ensure the safety of both the creatures and the communities they appeared in. What you've done so far is actually quite impressive, Dr. Matthews said, reviewing Frank's detailed notes and photographs. Your instinct to protect and document was exactly right, but now we need to move quickly to contain this situation before it escalates further. Sarah, who had listened to Frank's explanation of the past weeks with a mixture of disbelief and growing understanding, reached over and squeezed his hand. Why didn't you tell me? She asked softly. I wanted to protect you, Frank started, but Sarah shook her head. We're partners, remember? We could have handled this together. Dr. Matthews cleared her throat. If I may, we have a proposal for both of you. She laid out a plan that seemed almost too good to be true. Her institute would provide immediate financial support to secure the farm, establishing it as a protected research site. They would manage the media coverage, creating a plausible explanation for the unusual activity while keeping the truth secure. We've done this before, she explained, showing them photographs of other sites around the world where similar creatures had appeared. These beings seem to choose certain locations for their work. We don't fully understand their purpose yet, but we know they're peaceful, and their activities often have unexpected benefits for the surrounding environment. Outside, they could hear Dr. Matthews' team efficiently managing the chaos. The reporters were being corralled, given a story about experimental agricultural research that would satisfy their curiosity without revealing the truth. The police were standing down, and even the National Geographic researchers were being quietly but firmly escorted away. Mike Peterson appeared at the kitchen door, looking sheepish. Frank, he began, but Frank cut him off. You did what you thought was right, Mike. No hard feelings. And surprisingly, Frank meant it. In a way, Mike's actions had led to this solution he couldn't have found on his own. Dr. Matthews' team worked through the afternoon, transforming the crisis into a controlled situation. They set up sophisticated monitoring equipment around the geometric patterns, established proper security, and began a systematic study of the crystalline soil transformations Frank had observed. Most importantly, they showed Frank and Sarah that they weren't alone. Other farmers and landowners around the world had faced similar situations. There was a whole network of people working to understand and protect these mysterious visitors while maintaining their secrecy. The real work begins now, Dr. Matthews explained as evening approached. Your farm will become a crucial research site, but we'll ensure it remains under your control. The Institute will provide funding, resources, and expertise, but you'll continue to make the decisions about your land. Sarah, who had spent the afternoon absorbing everything and asking increasingly insightful questions, finally smiled. So our failing farm is about to become a cutting-edge research facility, while maintaining its cover as a working farm, Dr. Matthews confirmed. Your mortgage troubles are over, Mrs. Whitaker. Now we can focus on understanding why these beings choose certain locations and what their work means for our planet. As the sun set, Frank stood at the edge of his field, watching the creatures' lights pulse in their mysterious patterns. But now he wasn't alone. Sarah stood beside him, her hand in his, while Dr. Matthews and her team worked quietly in the background, their presence a reassuring reminder that he no longer carried this responsibility by himself. You know, Sarah said softly, when I married a farmer, I never imagined we'd end up hosting an otherworldly visitor. Frank chuckled, feeling truly relaxed for the first time in weeks. Life's full of surprises, isn't it? The creature's musical tones filled the air, and this time they sounded almost cheerful. Perhaps it too was relieved that the need for total secrecy was over, replaced by the protection of people who understood its importance and were equipped to help. The transformation of Golden Valley Farm over the next 2 weeks was nothing short of remarkable. Dr. Matthews' team had seamlessly integrated their research operations into the farm's daily routine, maintaining the appearance of a normal agricultural operation while conducting groundbreaking scientific studies. But it was what happened on a crisp Tuesday morning that truly changed everything. Frank had grown accustomed to his new morning routine: coffee with Sarah, a briefing with Dr. Matthews' team, and then his regular visit to the creature. The geometric patterns now covered nearly 2 acres, their crystalline structures glowing with an inner light that the research team carefully concealed with specially designed canopies. But this morning was different. As Frank approached the site, he noticed the creature was more active than usual. Its iridescent scales shifted colors rapidly, creating waves of blue and purple that rippled across its form. The musical tones it produced were more complex than ever, almost like a symphony rather than single notes. Something's happening, Dr. Williams, one of Matthews' top researchers, said excitedly as she checked her instruments. The energy readings are off the charts. Look at the soil crystallization. The transformed earth around the geometric patterns had begun to pulse in sync with the creature's movements. The crystalline structures, which had previously been static, now seemed to flow like liquid metal, creating new patterns that spiraled outward from the central design. Frank watched in amazement as patches of his drought-stricken soil began to change. "Get Dr. Matthews," Frank called out to one of the assistants. "She needs to see this." Within minutes, the entire research team had gathered. They watched in stunned silence as the creature began what could only be described as a dance, its movements perfectly synchronized with the shifting patterns beneath it. The musical tones grew louder, more purposeful, seeming to resonate with the very earth itself. "The soil composition is changing at a molecular level," one scientist announced, staring at his readings. It's becoming more fertile. The mineral content is increasing exponentially, and the water retention properties are unlike anything I've ever seen." Dr. Matthews arrived just as the phenomenon reached its peak. The creature's lights pulsed one final time, and a wave of transformation swept across the field. Where there had been parched, struggling soil, there was now rich, dark earth that seemed to shimmer with vitality. The corn stalks that hadn't been part of the geometric patterns suddenly stood taller, their leaves greener and more vibrant. "It's not just marking the field," Dr. Matthews breathed, her usual professional composure cracking slightly. "It's healing it, transforming it at a fundamental level." Sarah, who had joined them during the excitement, grabbed Frank's arm. "Look at the rest of the farm." Beyond the immediate area, they could see a subtle change spreading across their fields. The drought-stressed crops were straightening, gaining color and strength before their eyes. The implications hit Frank like a thunderbolt. "It's not just about communicating or creating patterns," he said slowly. "It's about restoration. It's healing the land." The research team sprang into action, taking samples and measurements from across the farm. The results were staggering. The creature had somehow engineered a complete restoration of the soil's health, introducing new mineral compounds and beneficial microorganisms that would make the land more resilient and fertile than ever before. This goes beyond anything we've seen at other sites, Dr. Matthews explained as they reviewed the data. The geometric patterns weren't just random designs. They were a blueprint for environmental restoration. Your visitor wasn't just choosing your farm as a landing site. It was choosing it for healing. The breakthrough had implications far beyond Golden Valley Farm. If they could understand and replicate even a fraction of what the creature had done, it could revolutionize agriculture, particularly in drought-stricken regions. The crystalline structures in the soil seemed to act as natural irrigation systems, distributing water and nutrients with unprecedented efficiency. As word of the breakthrough spread through the research team, Frank noticed something else. The creature seemed more relaxed, more open in its interactions. Its musical tones took on a quality that everyone interpreted as satisfaction. It had completed a crucial phase of its work, and now it was ready to show them more. "We're just beginning to understand its purpose," Dr. Matthews said, reviewing the preliminary reports. "These beings might be part of a larger ecological restoration network, choosing stressed environments to heal and enhance. Your financial troubles aren't just over, Frank. Your farm might help us solve some of humanity's most pressing agricultural challenges." Sarah, who had been quietly processing everything, suddenly laughed. "Remember when our biggest worry was making the mortgage payment?" she asked Frank. "Now we're hosting an alien agricultural expert who's turning our farm into a super soil testing ground." The creature responded to her laughter with a series of melodic tones that made everyone smile. There was no doubt now that it understood them, at least on some level. Its work wasn't just about patterns, or lights, or mysterious transformations. It was about connection, about showing humanity a better way to work with the land. As the sun set that evening, Frank stood in his field, running the transformed soil through his fingers. It was rich and dark, full of promise and possibility. The breakthrough hadn't just saved his farm, it had given it a new purpose. Golden Valley Farm would become a beacon of hope, a place where the future of agriculture was being rewritten by an unlikely partnership between human farmers and an extraordinary visitor from somewhere beyond their understanding. The creature's lights pulsed softly in the gathering dusk, and Frank smiled. Sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs came in the most unexpected forms, and the best thing you could do was be ready to embrace them when they arrived. The next phase of discovery at Golden Valley Farm brought a carefully selected group of the world's top agricultural and environmental scientists. Dr. Matthews had orchestrated their arrival with precision, ensuring each expert signed extensive non-disclosure agreements before being allowed anywhere near the transformed fields. Dr. Amrita Singh, a leading soil biochemist from Oxford University, was the first to present her findings to the assembled group in the newly established research center, a converted barn that now housed state-of-the-art laboratory equipment. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled up her data on the large display screen. "What we're seeing here defies everything we know about soil chemistry," she began, her voice filled with barely contained excitement. "The crystalline structures aren't just improving water retention, they're actively creating new molecular compounds that enhance nutrient delivery to plants. It's as if the soil itself has become a living, intelligent distribution system." The creature, which had grown comfortable with the increased human presence, hovered near the barn's open doors, its iridescent scales shifting through shades of blue and green as it seemed to listen. Frank noticed how it responded to certain words or tones in the scientists' discussions, further confirming his belief in its intelligence. Professor Chen Wei from Beijing Agricultural University stepped forward next, his usual stoic demeanor cracking as he displayed his team's analysis. "The corn yields from the transformed sections are unprecedented. Growth rates 3 times normal, drought resistance that shouldn't be possible, and nutrient levels that could revolutionize global food security." "But it's not just about the crops," interjected Dr. Maria Gonzalez, an environmental microbiologist. She pulled up microscope imagery that showed the teeming life in the transformed soil. These new microorganisms, they're unlike anything in our databases. They're actively regenerating depleted soil compounds and creating symbiotic relationships with the plant roots that we didn't think were possible. Sarah, who had taken to documenting everything in detailed journals, watched the creatures' reactions closely. "Look," she whispered to Frank. "It seems pleased with their understanding." Indeed, the musical tones emanating from their visitor had taken on an almost encouraging quality. Dr. Matthews stood up, commanding the room's attention. "What we're witnessing here isn't just an agricultural breakthrough. This could be the solution to some of humanity's most pressing challenges: drought, soil degradation, food security. But we need to proceed carefully, understand everything fully before we even think about wider applications." The validation from the scientific community was overwhelming, but it came with new challenges. Each expert wanted more time, more samples, more data. The pressure to publish findings, even in restricted, classified journals, was intense. Everyone could see the potential global implications of what was happening at Golden Valley Farm. Professor James Morrison, who had been quietly analyzing the creature's geometric patterns, made a connection that stunned everyone. "These designs," he said, projecting complex mathematical models onto the screen, "they're not random. They're a form of mathematical expression that corresponds perfectly with natural growth patterns, the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio. It's as if our visitor is speaking to us through universal mathematical languages." The creature responded to this revelation with a series of particularly complex musical tones, causing all the monitoring equipment to light up. Dr. Matthews's team rushed to record and analyze the response, adding another layer to their growing understanding. Late that afternoon, a secure video conference was arranged with the heads of several major agricultural research institutions. Frank watched as one by one, these global experts were left speechless by the data being shared. The transformation of Golden Valley Farm had implications that went far beyond one family's struggling property. Mr. Whitaker, the director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, addressed Frank directly. "Your farm has become perhaps the most important agricultural research site in the world. The potential applications of what we're learning here, it's beyond calculation." The creature, still hovering near the door, emitted a series of gentle pulses that seemed to ripple through the crystalline structures in the soil. The assembled scientists watched in awe as new patterns formed, spreading outward like waves on a pond. "It's not just showing us the results," Dr. Singh said softly. "It's teaching us the process. These patterns, they're like a manual, a step-by-step guide to soil restoration." As the day drew to a close, Frank found himself sitting with Sarah and Dr. Matthews, watching the sun set over their transformed fields. The validation from the scientific community had confirmed what they'd already known in their hearts. They were part of something extraordinary, something that could change the world. "We'll need to expand the research facility," Dr. Matthews said, already planning ahead. "More labs, more equipment, more security. Are you ready for that?" Frank looked at Sarah, who smiled and squeezed his hand. Their farm hadn't just been saved. It had become a beacon of hope for the future of agriculture. The experts had confirmed it. What was happening here could help solve world hunger, combat climate change, and restore damaged ecosystems across the globe. The creature's musical tones filled the evening air, and Frank realized that the scientific validation, while important, was just the beginning. They were all students here, learning from a being that had chosen their farm as its classroom. The real work, understanding and implementing these lessons for the benefit of humanity, was still ahead of them. "We're ready," Frank said, watching as the creature began its evening work, its lights pulsing gently in the gathering dusk. "Whatever comes next, we're ready." 6 months after the initial discovery, Golden Valley Farm had become something beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The creature's transformative work had spread far beyond the original geometric patterns, turning the once struggling farm into an agricultural miracle that defied explanation. But it was on a crisp autumn morning that the most extraordinary development occurred. Frank and Sarah, along with Dr. Matthews' team, gathered in the main field after their monitoring equipment detected unusual energy patterns. The creature's musical tones had taken on a new quality, something that felt like a mixture of celebration and farewell. "These readings are unlike anything we've seen before," Dr. Matthews said, studying her tablet with intense focus. "It's as if it's preparing for something. Preparing." The creature began to glow with an intensity that outshone the morning sun. Its geometric patterns, now covering most of the farm, pulsed with synchronized light that seemed to sink deep into the earth. The crystalline structures in the soil illuminated from within, creating a web of light that stretched across the entire property. Then, in a moment that left everyone speechless, the creature began to duplicate itself. Like watching cells divide under a microscope, they witnessed as it split into dozens of identical beings, each one glowing with the same iridescent beauty as the original. The air filled with their harmonious tones, creating a symphony that brought tears to every witness's eyes. "It's not leaving," Sarah whispered in awe. "It's expanding." Dr. Matthews' equipment nearly overloaded as it tried to process what was happening. The new creatures spread out across the farm, each one beginning its own geometric pattern. But instead of damaging the crops, they were enhancing them, creating a network of sustainable growth that would continue long after they were gone. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Matthews breathed. "It's not just transforming the farm, it's establishing a permanent regenerative system. These new beings are like gardeners, each programmed to maintain and enhance different sections of the land." Frank watched as one of the creatures approached him, its musical tones seemingly directed at him personally. In that moment, he understood. This had never been about just saving his farm. It was about creating a model for the future, a living laboratory that could help transform agriculture worldwide. The original creature, now surrounded by its offspring, produced one final magnificent display of lights and sound. The message was clear. Its work was complete, but its legacy would continue through its children and the transformed land they would tend. As the day progressed, the full impact of this final gift became clear. Each new creature had specialized abilities suited to different agricultural needs. Some focused on soil regeneration, others on pest control through natural means, and still others on weather resistance. They had effectively created a self-sustaining ecosystem that would continue to evolve and improve. The scientific team was ecstatic. "This is beyond anything we could have imagined," Dr. Matthews said, reviewing the preliminary data. "These beings aren't just showing us how to farm better, they're actively participating in the process. They've chosen to stay and help." The news sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Under careful supervision, similar programs were planned for other struggling agricultural regions around the world. Golden Valley Farm would serve as both training ground and proof of concept, a living example of how alien technology and human farming could work in harmony. For Frank and Sarah, it meant their legacy would extend far beyond what they had ever imagined. Their farm hadn't just been saved, it had become a beacon of hope for the future of agriculture worldwide. The creatures had given them more than prosperity. They had given them purpose. As the sun set on that remarkable day, Frank stood in his transformed fields, surrounded by the gentle lights of their new companions. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his as they watched the creatures work. "You know," she said softly, "when you first told me about finding a strange creature in our cornfield, I thought you'd lost your mind. Now look at us, partners with alien beings in the future of farming." Frank chuckled, watching as one of the creatures used its abilities to strengthen a row of young corn plants. "Life has a way of surprising you," he replied. "Sometimes the biggest blessings come from the strangest places." The musical tones of their original visitor echoed across the field one last time, not in farewell but in promise. The future of Golden Valley Farm, and perhaps of agriculture itself, would be a partnership between two worlds, working together to create something greater than either could achieve alone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below about what you would do if you discovered something extraordinary on your property. Remember, sometimes the most incredible discoveries come when we least expect them.